Good afternoon, or perhaps good morning, wherever you are. As the Director of Strategy at Resilience First, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar organised by Resilience First in conjunction with the Fire Protection Association. Resilience First mission is to help build resilience across business communities, whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. Please do visit our website, resiliencefirst.co.uk, to see the many projects and events we organise in an effort to help your understanding and application of resilience. We have recently formed a strategic partnership with the Resilient Shift organisation, so both our reach and output have expanded for the greater good. Our topic today is lessons learnt from the built environment from the Grenfell Tower fire. That fire on the 14th of June, just 4 years ago, was one of the UK's worst modern disasters. Besides the ongoing official inquiry, the repercussions are still felt today, not least by the victims and families affected. In this webinar, we're going to look beyond the tragedy itself and the ongoing inquiry and examine the implications for the built environment. We are fortunate to have here some real experts in the subject and are privileged to have Dame Judith Hackett, who was the author of the independent review of building regulations and fire safety following Grenfell. Other experts who have kindly given their time this afternoon are from the Fire Protection Association and the City of London Corporation. The FPA is our partner in organising this event, and we are greatly appreciative of their support today and as a member of Resilience First. I will shortly invite Sue Butcher to introduce the session and to chair the proceedings. Sue is Director of Communications Consultancy, Just Practicing Limited, and a member of the Fire and Building Safety Group at the Institution of Engineering and Technology. And she works with the IET Built Environment Panel. Sue will provide fuller introductions to our speakers today, certainly than I have done them justice, but you will find all their biographies in the joining instructions for this session. Throughout the event, I encourage all of you listening to ask questions of the speakers by posting those questions, hopefully brief, in the chat box to the right of your screen. I'm sure the chair will pick up as many as she can in the Q&A session, which you will help her if you can keep your questions direct and brief. Lastly, I should add that the proceedings are being recorded and we will share an edited summary and the slides and video used in the session in the next few days. Sue, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many people taking an interest in the topic of resilience, a concept that's becoming so much more visible in these changing times. By way of introduction, here's a short story. At 4 a.m. on Wednesday, the 14th of June 2017, I woke up and turned on the radio. BBC 5 Live was reporting on a terrible fire that was raging in a tower block in London. A tower block with a name I'd never heard of. Within a few minutes, I was downstairs at my computer, Googling, and in no time at all, I had found two things. Firstly, Edward Defan and Frances O'Connor's blog posts about living in the Grenfell Tower, including their prescient post 8 months before, which said the situation would change if there was a serious fire in a tower block. And secondly, a whole group of web pages published by consultants, contractors, and product manufacturers featuring their work on the Grenfell Tower. Now, whilst I trained as an architect, for the last 10 years, I've been a communications consultant, working to help construction product manufacturers face the future digital landscape, to help them communicate better. And over those coming hours, I watched dismayed as company after company took down their case studies. In many cases, I imagine, senior leaders in the business were telling their marketing team to delete the pages without realizing that you cannot, of course, erase history, especially with the internet. The experience of those weeks and years since have had a major effect on my career and no doubt on some of yours too. For the last year, I've been working with the IET's Built Environment panel, authoring a plain language guide for construction product manufacturers to help them digitise. And this work has emerged in that post-Grenfell landscape. But like all of us, manufacturers have had to look ahead and see possible tragedy before it happens. They have to be prepared. They have to act appropriately. They have to implement resilience. So what is resilience? Resilience is about how robust systems and people can adapt to new circumstances, how they can prepare for and deal with incidents, whether they are low or high risk, low or high impact, sudden or gradual change. To think ahead and prepare so that, as Resilience First says, they don't just bounce back, but bounce forward. There are three key aspects of the timeline to becoming more resilient, which I'd like you to think about today. And I'm going to mention them in what might seem like reverse order, but it's most appropriate for our conversation. Firstly, after a crisis, how can we learn? During a crisis, how can we cope? And before a crisis, how can we prepare? This session aims to look at the learnings from Grenfell for the built environment and how we can apply them more widely. The nature of our organisations and what it means to them to be more resilient, and how as resilient organisations and people we can better deal with the world outside, with government, with the media, with our communities, and with the public at large. I'd like to remind you that the Grenfell Inquiry is still ongoing, and although it's taking place in the public domain, it's crucial that we don't discuss anything that would be prejudicial to its important work. So please bear that in mind when you're asking your questions. Now I'm going to introduce our first speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Dame Judith Hackett, author of Building a Safer Future, the independent review of building regulations and fire safety, which was published in May 2018. This review, which I stress is separate from the Grenfell Inquiry, recommended, amongst some other very welcome changes, a clear model of risk ownership and the prioritisation of building safety in procurement. And it was also, I believe, the first post-Grenfell document to call for a digital record of buildings, including the products used to underpin a more effective understanding of our built assets. Remember, if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat box. Dame Judith, over to you.
Thank you, Sue, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Really pleased to have this opportunity to join this webinar. I'm very impressed to see just how many people have joined in to have this discussion around resilience and the need to learn lessons. I thought I would start what I want to say by reminding you all that my background is not in the built environment at all, but actually in the chemicals and oil and gas industry. I studied chemical engineering, and I joined the world's largest oil and gas company as a process engineer back in the 1970s. And over the next 20 years, that industry, from the 1970s, that industry that I was part of, had to learn some very hard lessons from catastrophic incidents which occurred both here at home in the UK and around the world. Names that we've become familiar with, like Bhopal, Seveso, Flixborough, and of course, Piper Alpha, an offshore oil and gas platform explosion, which occurred in 1988 with the loss of 167 lives, and which remains one of the worst industrial accidents that we have ever had in the UK. I don't intend to go into details of what happened, but what is important is to recognise that in all of those events, and especially in the case of Piper Alpha, it led to a major rethink throughout a whole industrial sector and by governments around the world as to how the industry should be regulated. There's no doubt that tragic events do cause everyone in, and those associated with any sector, to do a great deal of soul searching as to how we build greater resilience and avoid such terrible consequences happening again. As a result of that combination of a very different approach to regulation, in some countries at least, and because of a major culture shift within the industry, massive change did take place in the oil and gas and chemical industry. Standards and performance improved dramatically, but as we were all reminded back in 2005 and again in 2010, when major incidents occurred at BP facilities in Texas City and then the Gulf of Mexico, there can never be a place for complacency or for taking one's focus away from the system, or what some of us, particularly in the chemical industry, call process safety. Whilst we know that learning lessons is important, it isn't easy. First and foremost, it's important to get to the heart. And by the heart, I mean the root cause of why failure occurs. When a major explosion occurred in an oil and aviation fuel depot in Buncefield, here in the UK in 2005, it was easy for people to identify a failure that had occurred where a level gauge had caused a tank to overflow, which then created a massive cloud of flammable gas, which then found a source of ignition. But it would be a mistake to put all of the lessons that are to be learned from Buncefield around the importance of having reliable level gauges. The real cause of Buncefield was about much more than that. It was about acceptance prior to the incident of poor practice. It was about taking shortcuts. It was about lack of clarity around responsibilities, failure to assure quality of workmanship when maintenance was done, and many more things. When I list those things that are the real lessons to be learned, perhaps you start to see some of the parallels with the focus of our discussion today around the built environment. So let us now turn to building resilience in the built environment and the lessons we must learn from Grenfell. When I conducted my independent review in 2017-18, it became very clear to me very quickly that the root cause of the failure and the problem was a systemic one. Despite the heavy focus on cladding then and since, the resilience issue is much, much bigger than a single component. We have a system at present, until it is changed, which does not ensure or assure the delivery of buildings which are fit for purpose. There's a lack of clarity around who's responsible, a lack of thinking about buildings as complex systems which need to work as systems, shockingly poor levels of competence in some places, and a lack of quality assurance to enable people to build confidence that things will work when called upon to do so. There's no doubt that the regulatory system in its current form is inadequate, with poor levels of oversight and enforcement, and so all of those things need to change. We now know, of course, that that regulatory system is going to change. We will see not one, but two new regulatory bodies. But these regulators alone will not drive up standards by ever increasing levels of prescription. What we must also learn is that volumes of rules and guidance only lead to people playing by the rules. It doesn't really lead to people thinking about the true issues. So the new regulatory system will place responsibility clearly and firmly with duty holders, those who design, build, manage, and maintain the buildings, to play their role in maintaining that level of assurance and resilience. My personal involvement in delivering the changes I recommended has continued beyond the publication of my report. I currently chair the board which is overseeing setting up the regulator, but I also chair the Industry Safety Steering Group, which is driving culture change, also a means of learning lessons within the industry. The elements of culture change that are required to build resilience in this sector are many. We need to address that need for increased competence. We need better record keeping and information sharing. We need quality assurance, both of workmanship and materials. We need to recognise the importance of listening to and working with the users of the buildings, the residents in particular. And we need the industry to step away from its adversarial and fragmented approach to one of much greater collaboration around a unified purpose. But the most important element that will make a difference and build resilience in this sector is about leadership from within the industry itself and a commitment to doing the right thing. I've no doubt at all that the new regime will be a big difference to and will change the behaviours of many within the sector, just as regulatory change was a key part of making similar changes in other sectors, as I referred to earlier. But building resilience and truly learning lessons means never assuming the job is fixed and done and you can move on. It's about always being prepared to question and challenge, and remembering to be prepared to face up to just how serious the consequences are of getting things wrong. I lost count of the number of people I spoke to after Grenfell who said to me, "We knew we had problems, but we never thought it would be this bad." So we also need to learn to build resilience in multiple dimensions so that we don't just fix the problem we've just had. Yes, of course, we must ensure that we achieve new standards of safety in buildings in relation to fire and structural risks. But we also have to address other risks which we know are out there and where we need to build resilience. Issues like sustainability and net zero are already with us. We can't choose to do one but not the other. We have to do them all. That's what resilience really means for me, because we have to be ready and prepared for all events, known and unknown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dame Judith. That's some very interesting points there, which we'll pick up on the panel discussion. Now we turn to Howard Passy, who is Principal Consultant and Director of Operations at the Fire Protection Association. His many years of consulting on a broad variety of fire safety matters make him an excellent source of advice and experience for both lesson learning and for prevention. Howard, can you turn your camera on? And we'll speak to you now. Thank you.
Smashing. Thank you very much, Sue. Good afternoon, everybody. Inevitably, I'm going to touch on some of the points that Judith has already raised, but I think there's an element of inevitability in that, really, given the breadth and scope of the independent review. But there are 4 or 5 issues I think I'd like just to touch on in terms of learning lessons in terms of fire safety and resilience. Just need to click onto the slides. And for some reason, start presentation, thank you. I think if we look back and see how we've learnt our lessons in terms of history, I think we'll find that as a country we have I suppose a prevalence of introducing stable door legislation So we're waiting for something unpleasant to happen before we legislate against it ever happening again. And I've just provided a few key examples on the screen there: fire at Keighley Mill, 8 deaths, Factories Act, right through to Rose and Crown Hotel fire in Saffron Walden in 1969, which led to the introduction of the Fire Precautions Act, which was really the primary piece of legislation that existed before we introduced the Regulatory Reform Order. Post Bradford, and as a result of 2 EU directives, we did introduce the workplace regulations, or fire precautions workplace regulations, which were, I think, eventually deemed not necessarily to be suitable, which were then followed by the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order and similar legislation in Scotland and Northern Ireland, all of them promoting a risk-based approach to fire safety. And they were really, I suppose, 2 primary bits of legislation that were introduced not as a result of fire, but as a result of simply directives from the EU and a need to do things more consistently. If we look at, I suppose, more recently, you may recollect the fire that happened at Lakenhall House in 2009. 6 people died there. And that led to a series of recommendations made by the coroner, the vast majority of which I think we would argue weren't necessarily followed up or dealt with effectively. And if they had been, maybe Grenfell would have been a different experience entirely for everybody. The Grenfell fire, again, has led to the implementation of significant change. I've just listed some of the documents, guidance and such like, which is underway at the moment, following the independent review. Clearly, there's been a huge amount of work that's gone on across the relevant sectors in support of these changes, which is great. And I think we're to be encouraged that both the intent and the comprehensive nature of the approach following the review does appear to be leading to a far more robust legislative framework, despite the fact that we've introduced it as a result of a tragedy. But I think it's interesting to reflect that for both of those fires, the circumstances were very similar. Electrical fires or electrical equipment fires led to both internal and external fire spread. And one of the primary features was poor standards of compartmentation within the buildings that allowed the fire to spread internally and eventually caused so many significant numbers of deaths. But where does that leave us now? I suppose it brings me on to my next observation, really, which relates to both building materials and the methods that we use to construct buildings, or we do construct buildings with at the moment. Clearly, there are issues associated with combustible insulation, as we've seen from Grenfell, and they continue to exist, whether they are part of the cladding or whether they are within the structure itself. We're also seeing issues in association with light timber frame structures, and reams of guidance produced to help manage and mitigate that risk. And then more recently, cross-laminated timber and massive timber frame structures, which we're seeing a greater prevalence of. Similarly, modular construction, which has inherent cavity barrier issues, or clearly there are cavities between each of those modules which need to be effectively stopped and sealed. And then lastly, insulated concrete forms, which is using polystyrene or some form of plastic to create formwork into which concrete is poured to form the structure of a building. And I suppose a facetious question maybe, but have we learned nothing even from the Great Fire of London, for example? It's important to understand that piece of the legislation that followed that fire, albeit so many years ago, wasn't necessarily focused around providing effective life safety, but more so focused on resilience and property protection. And I think that we may have a way to go in our considerations in relation to ensuring the resilience of our built environment, and ensuring that the way we build and the materials we use are appropriate for the circumstances. Similarly, in terms of compartmentation, which I mentioned in reference to Grenfell and Lakenhall, they were significant factors in both of those fires. And they include facets such as cavity barriers, fire stopping, fire doors, and such like, and also fire strategies. And it's interesting to note that, you know, legislative change is requiring the introduction of fire strategies, which we as an organisation find are missing from the vast majority of organisations, whereas fire and rescue services are very clear that for certain types of premises, if you don't have an effective fire strategy supported by compartmentation plans and such like, then it may be somewhat difficult for you to do a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment. But the problem with compartmentation issues is that they're commonly hidden. They're key points of failure, as we see in many, many fires, and certainly through the consultancy work that we do as an organisation, it tends to be one of the bigger issues that we need to address through the fire risk assessment or consultancy work that we're doing, where poor standards exist throughout most buildings. But because they're hidden and overlooked, they commonly don't get considered in too much detail on a day-to-day basis. But I think the issue here is not only about learning from experience, but also the competency of those involved in the design, construction, refurbishment, and building management once the building is constructed. Which brings me on to the next point. One of the key actions on all facets of the associated sectors involved in design, construction and management, and highlighted in the independent review, is that competency and the need for greater rigour in ensuring all persons involved in design, build and management, and to ensure that they are competent to undertake their roles effectively. And the image on the screen there just shows you a selection of the various working groups that have been involved in developing competency frameworks and schedules over the past couple of years. And it's been encouraging to see the amount of time and effort that's been put into that, and the great work that's coming out of the back of it in terms of the competency requirements for those involved in those various facets. But of course, just using an example here, really, people don't know what they don't know, and it's not just about that initial competence, but it's got to be about maintaining competence going forward. And it's pleasing to note that the proposals from each of the working groups in the steering groups have highlighted the need for continuing professional development and for competency to be maintained. But just in terms of the images on the slide there, in 2015, the classification of diesel was changed as a result of changes to the CLP regulations, and the upper flash point for classification as a flammable liquid was increased, which brought it under the auspices of the DESIR regulations. However, the vast majority of organisations that we work with have yet to recognise that having diesel on site or compressed gas in cylinders requires them to consider and to have a DESIR assessment, or at least to have considered those risks effectively. But in moving forward, we have to ensure that whatever we're implementing isn't just about that initial competence, but it is about maintaining competence going forward. Existing legislation is very light in its explanation, and I think that we're taking great steps forward now in ensuring that we're a little clearer as to what those requirements might be, and in supporting that through training frameworks and such like. So who needs resilience, and would they know? Clearly life safety measures are ingrained in law, but sadly they set a relatively low bar. Quite appropriately, our focus has to be on life safety. But in terms of developing resilience, we do need to consider issues more widely in our view. If we were to take schools, for example, you consider a school building as a property, and if it's lost, then there is a loss, there is an insurance claim, and people move on. But how does that affect not only the resilience of the community, but also our national capabilities going forward? All have a significant impact. And just looking at some of the statistics from the last 5 years that were brought together by Zurich Insurance, it shows that there have been around 2,300 school blazes, which completely gutted 47 primary and secondary schools and seriously damaged 230 others. But then we also see at the same time the government looking to remove the requirement for sprinklers in new school buildings in their revision attends to Building Bulletin 100.
Can I give you a nudge?
Of course,
Please?
thank you.
Thanks.
But I think we probably need, in terms of the in terms of ensuring resilience, to make sure that those involved in the design phase of the building and certainly their clients are better informed, that they have a better opportunity to understand that they don't just have to meet the minimum requirements. They can decide what their own risk appetite is, and they can positively impact the resilience of their own building stock simply through making adjustments, or at least in deciding what their own objectives might be for the resilience of the building, whether that's, you know, how much of the building will be affected by fire or how quickly an operation may be up and running immediately afterwards. There are a couple of other points I wanted to make, and you just see the quote there from the independent review that the government should consider applying key roles and responsibilities for information product recommendations to other multi-occupancy residential buildings. But my concern is that in looking at high-rise and high-risk premises, which is right from a life safety perspective, and legislating for those, we're ending up with a two-tier legislative system. And we probably need to consider, how do we address other types of occupancies where similar significant risks exist, maybe not just from a life safety perspective, but particularly from a resilience perspective. And I suppose just touching back on comments earlier in terms of competency, it's interesting to note that under the Fire Precautions Act, the fire certificates were developed and implemented by competent persons working for the local fire and rescue service. And we need to get back to a position where competency is ingrained in what we do, and that we do truly learn from previous incidents effectively. So sorry for running over, but thank you for your putting up with me. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you very much, Howard. There are some very important insights in your what you've said, and we're clearly seeing some failures being repeated in recent history. That was most interesting, and big cheers to clerks of works. They certainly were crucial when I was working on site in the 1980s. Now, if I can ask all our speakers to turn their cameras and microphones on. We're now going to have a brief discussion about some of the issues raised by our speakers, and then I'll attempt to bring in some of the audience questions. So don't forget, you can ask your question briefly in the chat box, and we'll see what we can pick up. I'd like to begin with Dame Judith. Now, the issues associated with building regs and fire safety, they're not just a UK problem. I understand you're working with the state of Victoria and Australia on the building regs there. Can you tell us something about that?
Of course. Can you hear me? Is my mic on?
Yes, absolutely.
Good. Yes, I can. So I'm sure some people on this call will be aware that there have been similar fires in high-rise buildings in other parts of the world, including Australia. And they asked me to get involved in their building regulation review. So I think it is important for us to recognise that this is a problem that extends beyond the UK. And there are things that we can learn from one another. I was asked a question only earlier this afternoon as to whether there is anywhere in the world that I think has got this absolutely right and that we can all learn from. I honestly think the answer to that is no, but I think there are pockets of good practice. And if we were much, much better at learning from one another and putting that together in a way that we all do the best we possibly can, we could move forward quite a lot in a very short space of time.
That's good. I've noticed we have some audience members from all over the world, including in Ontario and in India, and which is good to see. I remember watching David Chandler. I don't know if any of you have seen him, the New South Wales Building Commissioner. He's been posting videos on LinkedIn about the new regulations in Australia. And it's quite interesting how he's doing the culture change bit, because he's sort of simultaneously empowering clients to identify what's wrong with their buildings and shaming out contractors and designers into what isn't acceptable. So they're quite worth having a look at. You also mentioned, of course, the chemicals industry and your experience there and their much better established safety culture in some ways. Do you think that the construction industry has a problem learning from other industries?
I don't think the construction industry is necessarily unique. I think we're all very good at rationalising why what someone else is doing doesn't apply to us. It's almost human nature for us to do that, and I think it's a significant weakness. If we were all to open up our minds to learning more from others, we could make progress on this whole issue much more quickly. And certainly, I think it doesn't make any sense to me for the construction industry to reinvent wheels, reinvent methodologies and means of increasing levels of resilience without asking others, what can we learn from you? How can we avoid making the mistakes that you made first time round so that we get there more quickly?
Absolutely. I think there have been a lot of comments about a joined up approach in the chat of various sorts, and I was thinking about that in terms of the competency initiatives and also just looking at it. We're looking at legal policy, regulation, standards, and integration systems. But we need to go beyond that, really, because we're really talking about culture change, aren't we, in our industry?
Indeed.
Absolutely, and I think maybe we can have a think about that. In the meantime, Terence, could I ask you a little bit about terrorism? Because I know you mentioned it a bit, and of course there are many other different risks, including fire safety. Now, I know that the City of London has been aware of that threat for a very long time, and they've had the Ring of Steel since the 1990s. Do you think that experience is partly what has made the city more forward-thinking when it comes to resilience?
Yes, indeed. As you say, it's not a recent thing. It's terrorism for us is balancing against the business continuity. From the Mansion House was the first terrorist event actually in the UK in the 1880s. They planted a explosive device there. It didn't go off, and 3 months later they came back and it did go off. So right from the 1880s, the City of London has been involved in terrorism, and we're at the forefront of national security and terrorism. We host conferences, 56 heads of state, for example, 3 years ago, Commonwealth heads of state attended the Guildhall. Massive security implications there. For people who may not be so familiar with the precautions to take, I would urge them to have a look at the City of London initially designed something called Project Servitor, and if you just Google that, you'll see that it's now a UK national scheme, and that's all about disruption of terrorist with their subtle hostile reconnaissance they try to undertake around the country. And we've trained up all the City of London staff. The success rate since doing that was a 70% increase in suspects being caught by the City of London police. So quite remarkable what you can do. You can develop and refine these processes as well for your own buildings. And then the one which I think is a poor relation in the UK government, and that is the Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure. So few people know about that. Again, look that up, CPNI, and great questions were in there for people. So where is your mailroom in your building? And what about your control room? Is that in larger buildings? Is that on the roof? Are you looking overview of the whole site? Have you got 2 hour fire separation there? Can you see everything? It's no point in really being in the basement area with these. And is your building supported by intelligent CCTV and fire detection there? And it's not by chance that when you go into the London Underground station, one of the first things you see as you go through the ticket barrier is that control room. Very visible, a deterrent you're being watched, and you see all the CCTVs there. So I think there's a raft of information people can obtain out there, and I do urge people to look at Project Servitor and the CPNI website. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Now, I know, Howard, you wanted to make a point during your talk about a potential for a two-tier regulatory landscape. Do you think, and I wanted to ask you and Dame Judith, whether you think the definition of higher risk buildings may broaden, or whether it should, and how the situation might evolve for that to happen? Because I know we're focusing at the moment on high risk residential as a whole, but do you think it will change? You want to start, Howard?
Thank you, Sue. I don't know if it will change, to be honest. I think we do have some history of this. I mentioned the Fire Precautions Act earlier, and people might think I'm an old duffer and referring back to the good old days, but that's really not the case. Under the Fire Precautions Act, there were designating orders, and those designating orders were introduced at different times. The first one was for hotels and boarding houses, which brought them under the auspices of the legislation, and the second was the factories, offices, shops and railway premises, which brought them under the auspices of that order. And I think, I hope, I suppose, that there will be a filtering down of requirements from the approach that's being taken in the high-rise and high-risk premises, so that we see a more consistent approach across other types of occupancy in terms of the requirements for competency of individuals, robust approach to design and development, and robust approach to management, and having the right people in the right place at the right time. I think it unlikely, maybe. I'm sure Dame Judith will know far more about this than me, but unlikely that the same gateway approach and golden thread requirements would be applied consistently. But it would be nice to think that it would be. I am concerned that there will be this two-tiered approach, and we'll continue to see the prevalence of value engineering in other parts of the built environment, which commonly waters down specific requirements, and weakening of some of the inbuilt fire safety aspects, which are so essential to providing the resilience of the premises as well as for life safety.
Dame Judith, do you think it will evolve to a broader scope, the regulation?
I very much agree with a lot of the comments that have been made. What we want is a proportionate approach to all buildings, and I am confident that we are working towards that. I've heard this concern about a two-tier system many times. I think what we'll actually end up with is a multi-tiered system, because that's what proportionate means. That you pay greater attention to the highest levels of risk, and you have a more rigorous regulatory regime for the highest levels of risk, and then proportionately you will do things working to the same principles, and that's what's important, but with a lighter touch in terms of regulation at the lower levels of risk. That's how the Health and Safety at Work Act has worked in relation to people's safety at work for many, many years, and has proved to be very effective. And that's what we're trying to model here. But what matters is you can't do it all by regulation. That's why the culture change in the industry is so important. And the thing that will determine whether it gets delivered or not is not the regulatory regime, it's the way industry reacts.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that regard, I think I'd like to turn to the process of managing it within a crisis. We've recently been living through a pandemic. And when you make decisions during a crisis, which is part of the resilience process, you have to be aware of that. You need much shorter feedback loops, and in order to enable quicker decision making. and you need to have a flatter hierarchy. So you know, many of you will have heard of smaller companies being able to pivot during the pandemic to produce new products. You've got hospitals taking the initiative and implementing their own strategies rather than waiting to be told what to do. And I wonder, associated with that, this whole concept of critical thinking, and encouraging critical thinking and enabling people to speak up in our industry. How do you think that's going to be possible? How can we encourage those behaviours in our organisations? I wonder if Howard would like to say something about that.
I think that critical thinking does form a part of what a huge number of people within the, you know, within these various facets that we've been talking about, design, construction, building management. I know certainly, you know, from a fire risk assessment point of view or from a insurance surveying perspective, you know, critical thinking is absolutely key to ensuring that, you know, the what ifs are considered. And I think that has to be encouraged. I think, you know, I mentioned earlier the, you know, issues associated with value engineering, and I think sometimes our focus is in the wrong place, and it shouldn't be on, you know, how do we save money doing this, but how do we consider more consistently and with as much breadth and depth as we possibly can the potential risks that exist, whether they be fire, flood, escape of water, security, unauthorised, you know, occupation of non-residential premises, etc., etc. And I think there are issues around cost as well that, you know, certainly as a contractor, we see huge pressure on cost, where organisations will expect a significant amount of work to be done for, you know, for very little recompense. And I think some of those things have to change as well. And I think lastly, it's about competency and it's about information. I know that when we were speaking earlier, Sue, I made reference to the information that's available through the Risk Authority website. Risk Authority is an insurer research scheme that's administered by the FPA. And there's lots of information there and lots of tools which will really help with that resilience side of the business for organisations to tap into. And similarly, some of the information that we published through our Know Your Building campaign on the FPA website. There's lots there, and people need to do their research and apply that information in their critical thinking, I think.
I know we've had a lot more questions. We've had questions about procurement and commercialisation. Obviously, it would be great to get into those subjects. Unfortunately, we don't have time, although it's clear that there needs to be a change in the financial structuring of the industry as well as in the regulation of the industry. So it's time for me now to pick up on a few threads from our discussions. I just wanted to mention a few things. Firstly, we should be aware that there is no place for complacency in construction, in the built environment or elsewhere. I was encouraged to hear from Dame Judith that the recognition that this is a systemic problem. It isn't about a particular product or system. And therefore, the solution will not only involve competency, but it will involve culture change as well as regulation and technology. So whilst the joined up systems need to be in place to require change, we as individuals need to play our part, whether we run organisations or operate within them. Now, I'd like to thank the speakers for their candid comments and for you for taking part, and for the FPA and Resilience First for organising this webinar. I'd like to think, like me, you've had your interest peaked today. Perhaps you've learned something new, or our discussions have given you an idea about how to do something differently. Please take your time to look at the work of Resilience First and reflect what we've heard today and see what steps you might take yourself in your community and in your organisation to become more resilient. And I'll hand over to Robert.
Thank you, Sue. And I'd just like to echo your final comments there. And on behalf of us, Resilience First, and the Fire Protection Association, and all those participating, I'd really like to thank the chair, you, Sue, and all the speakers, Dame Judith, Howard, and others who have contributed to this event for their superb contribution. So finally, let me close by asking you to sort of note what we are doing in future. Our next event is on the 11th to the 15th of October, when Resilience First is delighted to be supporting the Innovate for Cities 2021 conference, which is being delivered in partnership with UN Habitat and the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. So thank you again, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Cheerio.